to make his character Henry V, here portrayed by Ken Branagh in the film from 1990, bluntly assert that one Englishman was worth three Frenchmen, in the context of pretty much constant bloodshed between England and France. They didn't call it the 100 Years' War for nothing. According to the genocidal subjugator of the New World, Christopher Columbus, foreigners unfortunate enough to hail from outside of Europe were worth even less next to Europeans, a logic necessitated by the European project of violently expropriating land and resources from the Americas, and later, of course, Asia and Africa. With a magnification suitable to the greater cultural gap, writes Green of Columbus's brutal worldview, 1,000 Indians would not stand before 3 Spaniards. It's quite a curious calculation. I'm not sure quite how he came to that notion of 3 Spaniards equal 1,000 Indians, but that's what he said. So markedly and obviously different as Columbus's time was to our own, the sort of ideological contradictions have some similarities with the contradictions of our time. So in Renaissance and later Enlightenment Europe, the HLERM that was applied to allegedly inferior bodies in the colonially exploited parts of the globe, which you could argue would reach its kind of nadir with the Atlantic slave trade, jarred considerably with new humanist ideas also coming from Europe about the rights of all men, although not yet women or anyone else, however they might want to identify, to freedom, safety and protection under the rule of law. Today, what the theorist M.G. Kelly calls the differential valuation of life covert in Western globalization and imperialism is somewhat incompatible with the rhetoric of diversity, equality and social justice, now sort of increasingly embraced by the very institutions that are culpable for these sorts of Western abuses of the rest of the world. This is something that Matt's going to speak to in more detail shortly. And, you know, these institutions range from the military industrial complex to the state corporate media and other actors. And I think as the Media Lens website put it quite eloquently last year, with at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and in this quote they allude to the way that that movements like Black Lives Matter are sort of implicitly challenging this, you know, measuring or this quantification of people, of, you know, different lives in different communities and different parts of nations and the world. And they wrote, what does it mean when journalists who spent the last 2 decades promoting wars of aggression on brown and black-skinned people in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria and Yemen take a knee? So aside from this chasm between what is opportunistically said and what is sincerely believed, the French philosopher Alain Badiou states that Western human rights discourse, which is supposed to apply to every human, wherever they are in the world, whatever social grouping they belong to, whatever creed they belong to, without prejudice, depends actually paradoxically on casting non-Westerners as somehow not yet eligible for human rights. And this is due to the assumption that, as Badiou writes, the misery of the third world is the result of its own incompetence, its own inanity, in short, of its subhumanity. And I think the moment that you cast certain other people as being not quite human or subhuman, then they are sort of excluded or absented from this notion of what should be a kind of universal set of rights. And this highly selective conception of human rights is, Badiou argues, necessary to justify the latest iteration of Western military inventorism, of which Columbus was obviously a progenitor. He writes, from the heights of the West's apparent civil peace, it seems that the uncivilized demands of the civilized a civilizing intervention. Presumably once the uncivilized non-Westerners have been civilized by the civilized West, they will be welcome to the table. They will be allowed to partake of the human rights that Westerners enjoy. That's Badiou's way of looking at it anyway. So in addition to being the construct of a neoliberal order that must frequently resort to violence abroad to secure its economic and strategic objectives, this very parochial vision of human rights and the HLERM that's sort of connected to it has other intellectual underpinnings. The cultural and literary critic Terry Eagleton has upbraided several, and I quote from him, postmodern skeptics of universality, that believe in a culturalist style that moral values are just embedded in contingent local traditions and have no more force than that. Eagleton goes on to paraphrase the neo-pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty, who argues that those who helped Jews in the last World War probably did so less because they saw them as fellow human beings, but because they belonged to the same city, profession, or other social grouping as themselves. Now, I think at first glance, this thesis seems kind of reasonable to an extent. It's understandable up to a point if we care more about our relatives, our friends, and members of our immediate communities than we do about people on the other side of the world who we've never met or have had very little to do with. But then that implies another sort of problematic, doesn't it? That how do we then form solidarities with those distant others across national, ethnic, or other boundaries in order to address problems on a global scale, whether this is war, poverty, the climate emergency, and a whole host of other predicaments. In his characteristically humorous style, Eagleton puts the flaw this way, with a kind of slightly absurdist kind of scenario. He writes, first of all, personally, I only ever display sympathy to fellow graduates of the University of Cambridge. It is true that such credentials aren't always easy to establish. I have occasionally tossed a coin towards some tramp whom I thought I recognised as a member of the class of 1964, only to retrieve it furtively again when I realised my mistake. And then more succinctly, Eagleton states, and I've reproduced it for you here in the slide, if my bit of Oxford survives a nuclear catastrophe, I really couldn't care less about the University of Virginia. So as I say, Eagleton is taking his critique to a kind of absurd level, but it does highlight a kind of flaw in this sort of neo-pragmatist way of trying to justify why values and rights can't always be universalizable. So it seems to me the contemporary HLERM is kind of what we are left, or what we're reduced to, when liberal moral principles that are supposed to be universal come into conflict or clash with the social, economic, and political realities that are necessary for the survival and the sort of material operation of liberal capitalism around the world. In this way, the HLERM compromises not only establishment reactionaries like Lord Sumption, but even certain liberal and leftist activists who are trying to improve the world in good faith. And here I want to just talk a little bit about Kehinde Andrews' new book, The New Age of Empire. Kehinde Andrews is a race studies scholar and in this book, he interrogates a range of what we would think of as most people would call progressive causes for providing, and he writes, a narrow focus on full humanity for workers in the West and merely the right to life for those in the rest. And he gives a number of examples of this, which I think are quite provocative. So he says, first of all, that absent from any of the analyses of the Industry 4.0 program, which I think people may have come across, which is this plan that's becoming more and more a thing in progressive circles, this plan to harness green and digital technologies to try to democratize Western economies and increase opportunities and redistribute wealth and so forth. But the problem with that, as Andrew says, is that there's no questioning of just where the West gets the money and resources needed to develop the next industrial revolution. And he says that there's not enough thinking about how the rest of the world outside of these sort of Western economies will be exploited and used so that this what's been called the fourth industrial revolution can be sort of driven forward. Andrews also talks about the much vaunted Preston model of community wealth building that people may again have heard of, that includes, amongst many other initiatives, a cooperatively run coffee shop. This is a sort of telling example that Andrews gives, who's, and again quoting from Andrews, success is only possible because of the racial exploitation of the poor people farming the coffee beans it uses for next to nothing. So however well-meaning these projects are, implicit in them is a judgment about the relative welfare and opportunities of those who reside in the developed world and those who do not or cannot. On a slightly different but related tack, and to sort of tie back to something that I mentioned near the beginning, we have the contradiction of what is maybe uncharitably called woke washing and myself and Matt have written about this together previously, in which Western corporations, public bodies, government agencies, and dare I say, even universities are decolonizing their practices and making commitments to fighting racism and sexism within the workplace, which these are perfectly admirable aims. I myself, I'm sure there are other people here. But the problem is that simultaneously, these sorts of organizations are forming lucrative financial relationships with the armaments and fossil industries, which are complicit in destroying the lives and environments of many people of color, a disproportionate number of whom are women and children in many of these places, who are inhabiting the post-colonial world or the poor world or whatever you want to call it. So the thinkers that Eagleton lampoons that I mentioned earlier might well argue that, painful choice as it may be, we should privilege the lives of people we know, love and work with over the lives of those we have little or nothing personally to do with. But then that leads to another question, which is, what we might ask, well, what sort of a degraded world have we made that pushes us into such tough choices? And therefore ask what could be changed or should be changed about such a world in order to avoid these, very, very tough dilemmas. I'm going to chicken out of answering these questions right now. It may be something that we get into in the Q&A if people want to, to raise these issues again, and hand over now to Matt. If you want to take it away, Matt. And I'm just going to, while you talk, I'm just going to, there's a little bibliography there if people are interested later on, just so you know that I'm not completely conjuring what I've said to you out of thin air. And so there's just a couple of slides that will give you a link to a recent article that Matt wrote that he's going to sort of, I think, summarize or speak to now. So.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So, thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Rachel, and everyone. So I just want to add a short story to that, a case study, which relates, I think, reasonably well to what Tom's saying about the value of human life over different societies, and as that is done through the media. And I'll tell you this through a story that was published recently that I wrote for the Morning Star. So several years ago, I wrote an article for The Guardian, and in it, I was talking about the CIA, and in it, I mentioned that the Mujahideen, which were this organization in Afghanistan, as you probably know, I just called them quite casually, uncontroversially, I called them terrorists. They had been the forerunners to Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda network that destroyed the Twin Towers. But then when it was actually printed by The Guardian, they had changed terrorists to freedom fighters. And I was like, oh, that's strange and curious. And I didn't particularly care, but I was just curious about it. And I realized that probably the reason that they did that was, at least at some level, ideologically, they were saying, oh, well, those guys were good guys at the time because they were fighting against the Soviet Union. And then, of course, they became bad guys immediately and automatically, axiomatically, when they declared war on the West. So it got me thinking about how, to what extent is it possible to get ideas that go against the ideological grain on Western foreign policy in particular into the mainstream. What will happen if you write something really, really well and really, really accessibly? Will it trump the ideological concerns that editors and owners have at those publications? And I thought, well, I'll never really have the opportunity to do that anyway, because I only do a bit of part-time journalism. But then I had this opportunity to do it. I won't name the publication, but it's a reasonably big publication that people will know, but it's just awkward to do so. So I won't do so. But I worked with a team of media scholars. All of us were media researchers. We'd all published peer-reviewed work about the nature of the media and about the nature of using work by Noam Chomsky and Ed Herman and those kind of people about unfairness in foreign policy representation. And so we were assigned an editor and wrote this piece that was very carefully done, everything perfectly perfectly referenced, and was cleared by the editor at this publication. And we'd done this over a period of about 8 or 9 weeks. And then on the morning that it was due to go out, and the person who had edited it actually had a headline which was how Western states support terror while millions die. And it was probably the most graphic, in-your-face, mainstream headline article that you could possibly, that certainly I'd seen, to do with foreign policy. And then an hour later, we were called off, and it was cut by the executive editor of the publication. The article itself has ended up in the Morning Star. Actually ended up on a couple of piece publications first. And basically what we tried to do was to just go through in the most succinct possible way. There are lots of organizations like Declassified UK, FAIR, I don't know if you know FAIR, Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, Media Lens, these kind of organizations. They're all really good, but their work is over a very long period of time. So my idea was to write the most accessibly easy to read piece of work that you could possibly imagine, that summarized absolutely everything in the most perfect way. So, and also specifically just looked at the specific things that were omitted, totally omitted from foreign policy coverage. So, for example, we found scientific paper that showed that under the Trump administration, the Venezuela had sanctions put on them by the Trump administration in 2017. Now we know from a peer-reviewed, totally accepted scientific paper that as a direct result of those sanctions, not of the poverty of the country, but we know as a direct result of those sanctions that 40,000 people died in just a year. And it would have been much more, but no one bothered counting after that. 40,000 people died. And one of the major causes of that was the fact that the American government had refused to allow in dialysis machines and HIV medicine into Venezuela. Now that's very specific things that are just omitted entirely from the media. So that was a good, clear example. But we also looked at, and no one had reported that. There was one article in the Independent newspaper in the whole of the Western world, one article in the Independent that had commented on it. And we did this similarly with other countries. So we did it, for example, with, what's reported about Saudi Arabia, for example. Well, actually, the coverage there has changed and has improved considerably. But there are still government reports of things that sorry, my cat's attacking me. But there are still government reports that I've just never picked up on by the media. So even the British Parliament, in cases like the NATO invasion of Libya and the US-UK invasion of Iraq, the UK Parliament produces evidence, but then it's just ignored. Even though it's the most mainstream thing you can possibly think of, the papers still ignore it. Let me see if there's another example here that I can find off the top of my head. Sorry, I didn't have very long to prepare this. Actually, the invasion of Libya is a good example, where the UK government admitted that actually Colonel Gaddafi was not going to massacre anybody. They said they found out afterwards, we had no evidence at all that this was going to happen. And there was the allegations that was basically what triggered the war, that the idea was that there was going to be an attack by the Gaddafi government on just random people in Benghazi. But the UK government admitted afterwards that that didn't happen. Now, that was just not reported anywhere in any newspaper. And there were similar things about, say, Iraqi sanctions on Iraq in the 1990s. Things just weren't reported. The fact that, the sanctions regime, for example, the idea of the sanctions regime was to stop chemical and biological weapons being built. But actually, they were doing things like banning, they wouldn't allow the import of shrouds for dead people. But that was just not reported anywhere. You had to go to the technical literature to find this really quite shocking information. So we went through all of those examples, and we also covered Egypt, and we mentioned Bolivia, although that's been more of a pertinent one recently. We talked a bit about Russiagate, how the fact that there'd not been someone who had referred to there hadn't been a skeptic about the hacking, the idea that Putin had hacked the US election. There hadn't been a skeptic on MSNBC since January 2017. So we were looking at all of these different examples. Anyway, I think I'll cut it short there, but to say that, we then went back to some of the comments that we had were things like, you can't, hang on, let me just see. So the headline that we had, which was "While Millions Die," had been removed. This was these were the actual details that we could see on the interface that was up in front of us. We could see it all in real time. All references to East Timor were referred to from atrocity from the 1970s. Indonesia and Venezuela had been removed. In fact, our references to Noam Chomsky, Ed Herman, the Vietnam War, and even our own statuses as scholars of propaganda had been removed by the executive editor. Our paragraph on NATO and Libya was annotated with "needs line in here about nature of Gaddafi regime, can't ignore its atrocities." In response, we observed that mainstream evidence made it clear that it was our rebels in Libya who conducted large-scale human rights abuses against Black Africans. Furthermore, NATO intervention magnified the death toll by at least 7 times, according to a study in a high-ranking journal called International Security. The House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee stated, despite his rhetoric, the proposition that Gaddafi would have ordered the massacre of civilians in Benghazi was not supported by the available evidence. More widely, and basically these same patterns happened again and again. I want to emphasize, and one of the reasons I wanted to get this article into the Morning Star was because when this information kind of came out about what happened with our story, it was reported by the alternative media in kind of I don't know, ways that I didn't particularly like. So, for example, it ended up in a conspiracy magazine. I don't know if you can see this now. I'm just going to see if I can get you get this up. But it was reported in a conspiracy magazine as censored. And I don't like that kind of thing because I'm trying to be a serious scholar of media and of politics. And actually, I think if we start throwing around terms like censorship, I think that's unhelpful. This basically a publication made a political choice, but it was an extremely clear political choice to not publish our work, which they had every right to do. But I nevertheless think that it is interesting, notable, very, very illustrative of the very narrow focus that these media organizations have. And bear in mind, this was a liberal news organization. This is about as left-wing, about as academically friendly to our way of thinking, wants a better world and all that stuff. It wasn't the Sun, but it's very illustrative of the way that kind of mindset and those kind of industries operate. Unfortunately, the mainstream is just not, when it comes to foreign policy, it's just no one's friend. It really isn't anyone's friend. And that I've learned that through, I mean, I already knew that, but I spent whatever it was, 4 months trying to sort of bash my head against the wall to get something into the mainstream, to really cement that in my own mind that you can't really, there's so much crucial information that is omitted for ideological reasons by the mainstream press that you can't really trust it on foreign policy. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was splendid. That's great. What an insight into the machinations of these things. Before we move to questions and comments from people, I'm really pleased that there are 26 of us here, which is goes beyond mine and Matt's expectations. That's fantastic. Before we do that, I just need to mention again that this event is brought to you as part of Portsmouth University's Global Week 2021. There are lots of other really exciting events going on. I would urge you to have a look at the Global Week webpage to take a look at, this is just the first day, and we've got another 6 days of events for your enjoyment. And also just need to mention that the Global Week supports the British Red Cross COVID-19 response. That's who we're sort of working in association with. If you would like to support this cause, please civic funding page that is available. As of when this turns into a video, which will be made available, I'm not quite sure how these hyperlinks will work, but it will be easy enough, I think, for you to figure them out. And do, of course, follow the Global Week website and get on to the mailing list if you can, and that way you can be kept, and check out #UOP as well. So, okay, someone has sent a comment in already. Now, let me just check. Oh, thank you, Rachel, for, yes, you can see in the chat box that there to get that information. So, okay, let's stop sharing so I can actually see people now. And any questions, comments, or thoughts about anything that we've talked about so far?
Or comparable experiences, no doubt.
Good point. Yeah. I hate it when this happens. No. Maybe just give us a few moments.
I'll chip in, guys.
Come to the rescue. Thanks, mate.
Yeah, thank you, Tom and Matt, for that. It's really interesting. I missed the first 10 minutes, so anything that I might say could have been might be redundant or might have been covered already. Yeah, really interesting talks. And Matt, yeah, my commiserations, because I think I've had a similar experience.
Yeah.
Of having, we've spoken about it before, of having material spiked material along the same lines, really. Yeah, it's really just a question on.
That was on Syria, I think. I seem to remember.
That's right. It was on Syria in 2017 when Trump bombed Syria, and apparently opposing that was not the thing to do in a liberal publication. Anyway, yeah, I think this is really more of a question, or I don't know if it's a question, just a comment to Tom, really, because you were talking about how certain populations are considered expendable, but of course it just made me think that, of course, it's not just about killing, is it? And it's also about rendering populations or confining populations to a kind of half-life, like you have in Gaza, in refugee camps, in places like the favelas in South America. And it made me think of a book that I read recently by Akhil Membe, which is Necropolitics. And he has this idea that, more and more you have these surplus populations that are confined to kind of liminal spaces and camps of various different types, the camp form, as Membe puts it. So yeah, I don't know if that's, I can't really cohere that into a question, but it's just about, I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that idea that we're not just talking about populations being killed, we're talking about populations being put in a position where they're kind of the living dead, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Stephen. Absolutely. You could also talk about certain kind of is the word deterritorialization of people within, you know, cities. I mean, Black Lives Matter might speak to the sort of ghettoization of African Americans, you know, which is a historical process, isn't it? Whereby communities are kept in situations of poverty and lack of educational opportunities, poor healthcare, etc., etc. So yeah, it happens sort of domestically within, you know, the so-called advanced and developed countries, but you know, as you rightly say, it happens in the, you know, the periphery or the poor world, you know. And I think you know, sort of talking about Gaza is a great example, isn't it? And you know, these sort of areas that are kept in conditions of poverty or kept in conditions of constant harassment and abuse. That's a whole dimension to it. Another really good book, which we've talked about before, is Biopolitical Imperialism by M.G. Kelly. And he talks about a whole range of these ways in which this kind of parasitical relationship exists between, you know, the rich and the poor world. He talks about, you know, even things like, you know, while no one would blame anyone for moving from a poor part of the world to a wealthier part of the world to find work, you know, there's unfortunately part and a concomitant of that is that it's sort of talent being extracted or expropriated, isn't it, by, you know, a wealthier country like the UK or the US. And, you know, we can, and this is a sort of point actually that Kehinde Andrews would make, that it's great for our NHS, and if you're in Britain and you're benefiting from the undeniably excellent institution that the NHS is, from Filipino nurses and African doctors and so on and so forth, but unfortunately that's at the cost of that expertise and that talent being available for the rest of the world. So it's a very difficult, really difficult sort of dilemma. You know, but there are these different sorts of exchange rate mechanisms, if you like, that come to bear on, yeah, as you say, not just life and death, but also work and location and positioning and imprisonment and, you know, deterritorialization and so on. So yeah, you know, potentially there's lots of different sort of dimensions to this, I guess. I don't know if you'd have anything to add to that, Matt, because it's something you're interested in.
Well, I was going to say one brief thing, which was just that on Israel-Palestine and on Syria, they were two areas that because we wanted to make this the most mainstream stylistic thing possibly imaginable, that would have the least controversy with anyone. It's just purely the most obvious omitted facts. We actually left out things to do with Israel-Palestine, which you decide if that's morally right or not, but you know, it was one of those things. We left that out as a case study, and also we left out anything that was any hint of conspiracy. So, for example, there was a chemical weapons attack in Douma in 2018, which was used as a pretext for American strikes, and there is severe doubt as to whether that was conducted by the state. The expert opinion is split as to whether it was a false flag attack by the resistance on the ground. Don't know, but we decided to avoid that when we picked anything that sort of could be awkward like that. So we just went for simple things like, I mean, who's got an ideological position on Venezuela or on East Timor in the 1970s? Well, it turns out that actually the media does. The media still cares about these things. They're so desirous to show the West, to feel that the West is right. It's a slightly different culture, I think, to being kind of open, and you know, I think there's real doctrinal things that run through the all of those kind of organizations. It doesn't take much to have that sort of doctrinal shift.
So there's a question from Amanda Gary. It's coming on the chat. So I'll just read that out for us. Given the UK's volte-face on the status of Nelson Mandela and Matthew's example of the Mujahideen, are you predicting which groups or individuals might be recategorized one way or the other in the next few years? a really good question.
That's an amazing question.
Well, you mentioned, Matt, didn't you, about Saudi Arabia? Yeah, it's very, very good question. But you mentioned about Saudi Arabia, how it's like, what are the kind of, sort of material conditions or the ideological conditions? How have they shifted so that we now seem to get more critical coverage of Saudi Arabia? I mean, I saw a very good documentary on BBC Two, I think it was a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 parts, where it was a huge expose of all the problems with the Saudi regime. The kind of hounding of pro-democracy activists, the appalling treatment of women, the kind of really horrific sort of arms dealing that the West is involved with. Now, I mean, that wouldn't have been, I don't think you would have seen a mainstream documentary on BBC Two or some equivalent channel 10, even maybe 6 or 7 years ago, right? I don't know.
I agree. I'd like to hear what Amanda had in mind for that, but do you mind if I just very briefly say that I think coverage of Saudi Arabia I don't know about the other groups, but I would say that coverage of Saudi Arabia has changed because of the assassination of the Washington Post journalist a couple of years ago. And so there's been a tonal change. But nevertheless, will that be sufficient is a tonal change in media coverage sufficient to change actual policy? Seems unlikely. And it's interesting that in the updated version of the piece, I started looking into this more over the last couple of weeks, and there are still key things, again, reported by the House of Commons, but not by the media. So, for example, you'll find no article that shows how the UK military is essential to the war effort in Yemen by Saudi Arabia. I think there might have actually been a Channel 4 news report once that alluded to it because it followed British, it followed the planes going into Saudi Arabia, but no newspaper has covered that at all. They do talk about arms sales, but not about how Britain is essential to actually facilitate that war. If Britain wasn't doing the training and doing the supplies on the ground there, that war could not be prosecuted. And bear in mind that's been going on since 2015 under Obama.
Excellent.
Did Amanda have
any other questions, or
did Amanda have an idea in mind of what other groups might be changed? Because we just sort of went straight off into Saudi Arabia there, and there might be many others on mind.
She gave the examples of, sorry if I didn't make this clear, Nelson Mandela. Obviously there was a change, was it a massive change in sort of attitude towards him from the West as being, Thatcher called him a terrorist, right, didn't she? And then not even 10 years later, he became this kind of secular saint, this kind of liberal hero of anti-racism and sort of social justice. She also mentioned the Mujahideen, which you already talked about. But I guess as these kind of strategic objectives change, so the casting of these sort of groups abroad or these figures abroad changes. I mean,
well, oil may become less important, in which case there might be a freeing up of the ability to treat Saudi Arabia with the kind of disdain that their government deserves.
I'm also conscious of Vietnam and how there was such a significant shift there that the personnel who'd been out there came back and really hated themselves for being involved in something where public opinion. And I wonder if something similar will happen regarding.
Sorry, Randy, it's difficult.
I think you're tapping your mic there. I think you might be tapping your mic.
Sounds like there's a sort of scraping or scratching sound that's drowning you out. Sorry, Mandy, we can't quite.
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually. We began just referring to Vietnam very, very briefly. We actually we began the article. we began the article by referring to what we called the greatest case of media conformism and groupthink from the 1960s, which was the idea that the United States was defending South Vietnam against North Vietnam. But actually, Chomsky pointed out at the time, when he first got into activism, he said, well, you're not defending against North Vietnam, you're attacking South Vietnam. And this was heresy. It was barely kind of understood because it seemed such a strange thing. It's like, no, we're there with troops in South Vietnam to defend it. And it's like, well, actually, if you go to the map of the bombs that fell on Vietnam, look at the end of it. You'll see by 1975, 2/3 of the bombs from the United States had fallen on the South. So, you know, it was kind of a macro scale of that old saying, we had to destroy the village to save it from itself. It's the same thing, but on a nationwide scale. And of course, that nationwide scale actually also went into Laos and Cambodia as well. But these are historical things, but there's a similar thing going on with a genocide in East Timor. And those kind of huge heresies, huge things that just can't be said, can't even be recognized at the time. And I think that goes back with philosophers going back. There's always huge things that people can't get their heads around, whole organizations, whole institutions. But that's a slightly different thing. There's another question, I think. Oh, no, Anne has to leave.
Oh, Amy has raised her hand, so virtually. So go ahead, Amy. Yeah.
Hi, thanks. I just wanted to ask if you had any more information or any interesting research to share, kind of bouncing off of the HLERM thing, and kind of the comment that you made about like when quote unquote the non-civilized are made civilized by the civilized, and they can enjoy the privileges and the rights of the civilized. I was wondering if you had come across any kind of interesting research of that kind of process of, like, for example, when an asylum seeker comes into the UK and they are you know, they have all the challenges kind of because they're seen as a lesser person, what the kind of process is of, like, okay, they've been accepted, their asylum claim is accepted, that's one step, and then they get a job, so that's another step, they're in an even higher regard in the eyes of society. That kind of like process of, like, okay, after they've been put onto certain scale, like the climb up the scale, if I've explained that in any kind of comprehensible way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Amy. Thank you. And I think what you're talking about is a sort of inversion of what Badiou. I got that quote from Badiou about, you know, how you know, non-Western people in the poor world become eligible for human rights. And what you're talking about is, yes, that can be done through, as you rightly said, people migrating to the imperial center, or the, you know, the sort of Western world, and going through a process of trying to sort of you know, integrating or doing what's expected of them to become like the majority. And obviously there are all sorts of you know, all sorts of kind of problematics related to that link to you know, sort of belonging and you know, what people have to do in order to feel like they are accepted by a society. So that's a really good example, I think, of that. I think Badiou does talk a little bit about that in the context of the sort of French, you know, French kind of multiculturalism, and so he is aware. I think he does sort of acknowledge that there's a kind of domestic version of that and a foreign version of it. In terms of other examples of where that's happened, I mean, I suppose maybe it's a case of when countries do finally submit to Western power as a result of military intervention or other forms of, you know, cultural imperialism, they then do start to be sort of valued as being proper human beings and therefore eligible for those sorts of rights. I'm trying to think of, you know, all they get. I mean, the case of, I mean, Chomsky, Matt also mentioned Chomsky. Chomsky's talked about the case of Hawaii, which was but brutally annexed by the Americans in the late 19th century and became the last state, the 50th state, I think, of the US. And so in that, of course, there are still appalling inequalities and, you know, various kinds of discrimination that go on across the United States and in Hawaii. But I suppose once, you know, maybe when you are formally annexed or become part of an empire, you become a, you know, a state of the United States or whatever configuration you're talking about, you're then at least subject to the kind of laws of that state, and then in theory at least you're eligible for certain rights. But whether, you know, the question is whether in practice people actually can exercise those rights. So that's one example that I can think of. I'm sure there are others, but of course that doesn't happen when the military operation doesn't go to plan. I mean, the United States couldn't force Vietnam into its orbit, you know. 3 million dead, I think, in excess of 3 million dead, absolutely ravaged, as Matt was talking about, by American bombs. I think in Operation Rolling Thunder, in 2 weeks, they dropped more bombs than any side did in the whole of World War II. And still they couldn't bring Vietnam under the heel. I mean, Vietnam is now closer to China, I think, is really, you know, and has remained a sort of state, a strange kind of state capitalist, quasi-Stalinist sort of regime today. So yeah, that it wasn't, you know, very often these sorts of projects of intervention actually don't work and they backfire. And at the time in the 60s, there was a lot of support for the Vietnam War. Now it's really hard to find anyone who looks back at Vietnam and thinks that what a great job, you know, jobs are good and kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that, Matt.
Well, only that shows the importance of very targeted media, because as soon as you look back on it with dispassionately, like we can now, some the things that happened in the 60s and 70s were just so clearly disgusting. But at the time, you know, the media was on side, so, or pretty well on side anyway. There's a bit more freedom in the way that conflict was reported. But you know, it just shows how a population can be dragged along very dangerously with all sorts of different enterprises, most horrifically war. Should
we have these questions are so damn good. I wish we had some kind of more time to accommodate more if people have more.
Paul has one.
Yeah, Paul, I can see your hand up.
Hasn't the media always been on side? In terms of foreign policy, I mean, I had a job once in one of the famous clubs in London, and you know, you'd always see the media, you know, sitting, you know, having lunch with, you know, certain people in the Foreign Office, and then, you know, a week later there'd be a really sterile issue that had come up. So I just feel that I'm, you know, a bit negative about it all, really. I don't think the truth ever really comes out until it's been completely, you know, sterilized for our consumption.
Well, yeah. I mean, yeah. I guess the point is that you could almost say this is very predictable, but I guess the main point is that by any textbook version of what the media does, the media is there in opposition to the government, is there to hold politicians to account, is there to check the atrocities committed by states, by their own states. And typically the media is presented as, by anyone with any kind of power, and by themselves, by journalists themselves, as being very oppositional and being campaigners for truth, democracy in the American way, Watergate, and all that kind of thing. So one of the reasons that it matters to say it is because that view is quite prevalent, probably the dominant sort of textbook view of the way the media works. So although in a way I'm a bit like you, Paul, I'm a bit like, I know this, I don't need to spend my whole life knowing that the media just follows exactly what the politicians do. But nevertheless, it's quite important because there is that it highlights that severe difference and that ideological problem. But really, when I am opposing the media for its bias, and when what we're really doing is opposing arms dealers, mad generals, and cynical, horrible, doctrinal politicians. That's what really we're doing, and the dumbass media. But we're opposing all of those people who are involved in a culture of state violence. It's just that by approaching the media first, it's kind of a clearer way in. We all know the politicians are bastards.
Can I just? Sorry, Matt. Can I just?
Yeah, that's it.
Sorry to interrupt. I just want to read. In case we're in danger of all agreeing too much, I just wanted to read an interesting comment from Benjamin Bray. Thank you. He says, as someone from the United States, I can say from my limited personal perspective, attitudes towards the Vietnam War here are still mixed. There was a documentary by Ken Burns, which is very good. I've seen some of that came out here that was still really controversial even today. So yeah, I suppose you're always going to have sort of disagreement and different ways of kind of remembering and different sort of perspectives on these events. We're going to have to bring it to a close. Already people are saying that they've got other meetings to get to and so forth. So it just remains for me to thank most of all you guys for coming along and for your, like I say, excellent questions, really, really perceptive. I wish we had more time to kind of deal with them in more detail, but thank you to Matt for agreeing sort of relatively late notice to kind of chip in. I think it was a really important contribution. Thanks to the University of Portsmouth for hosting this, to Claire and Rachel and the others for setting this up and letting us do this. And please do check out other Global Week events, because it's a really sort of varied and intriguing sort of variety of different events. Thanks very much.
Really kind comments in the chat as well. Thank you for those.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Thanks. We will try. Sudip is saying do another one soon, where we could maybe focus on some other areas of controversy, maybe. Great. All right. Thanks very much.
All right.
Goodbye. Cheers.
Bye.